what's in the news. How much news is there? How much commercials? Sports and weather and chatter and all the telling you what they're going to tell you later. And consistently, we've done 8 surveys now. It's a very unhealthy, very unbalanced diet of information all over the country. Big markets, small markets, it doesn't matter. It's terrible.
Give us some good examples.
Well, crime is the dominant topic in the news all over the country. In our surveys, crime stories are 30 to 50% of the news. And then when you add a healthy dose of trivia and fluff and bears at the zoo, it doesn't leave time to discuss all the other important issues in our communities. Around the country, 50 million people tune in every night to find out what's going on in their communities and in the nation. And when there's so much mayhem and violence in the news and so much trivia, there's no time to talk about education, the environment, art, science, government, health, all these important topics. Night after night after night, the stations are leaning on this diet of mayhem in the news, which we feel is dangerous, has side effects that reverberate throughout our democracy.
What would you say, are you familiar with Sheri and his studies? We were talking about that earlier. When TV enters into a community, what are some of the effects?
Well, Mander's first book back in the 70s, that 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television, I think started when he was trying to find out what is the effect of television watching on the brain. And he called his researchers and said, well, find what's been written. And they all came back to him and said, there's nothing. The techniques are not even available now to know what those insidious effects are of having that cathode ray, as Mander describes, of 25,000 volts, right, going into your brain, putting these identical images in people's minds. So often the evidence is fairly anecdotal. There have been hundreds of studies now in children showing that watching television violence teaches violent models for behavior, makes children less empathetic to victims, right? In adults, it desensitizes them. It produces what George Gerbner calls the mean world syndrome, where people get this distorted, gloomy view of reality. They're afraid to go out at night. Presumably, they just stay home and watch more television, and it reinforces it night after night after night. It's very dangerous for democracy.
So your packages are designed to not only inform, but to also empower people to use those tools?
Well, we're trying to shine a mirror back at television and try to challenge the industry to change their tune. They've lost sight of the idea of the public's airwaves. They've completely abandoned the concept of the public interest. Profit is their bottom line. Journalism seems to take a backseat to the profit motive. We're also trying to encourage people to start talking back to television. A few years ago in Denver, on the Martin Luther King Day parade, 10,000 people marched for brotherhood. At the end of the march, a little scuffle broke out. What led the 5 p.m. news? The scuffle. A nun in town called the stations and said, "How dare you do that?" And on the 10 p.m. news, what led the news? The march. So people talking back to television stations can have an impact. It's hard. They're hooked on this diet of mayhem and violence and trivia. It's great for ratings. It's terrible for democracy.
Do you think people need a course in media literacy?
Absolutely. Television watching is the major waking activity of millions of people, and most of us have not been taught how to filter, how to protect ourselves, how to immunize ourselves against the power of television. The linear flow of television stories in the news is really scary. You never have time to stop and say, hey, wait a minute, what was that I just saw? What did that mean? Let me think about that. Will you do that again? Are they giving us the facts? The next story is panting in the wings, ready to come on. The anchors don't even breathe between stories, right? and it comes at you. And well, we're finding, for example, in the last survey, there was a station in Cleveland that had 38% advertising. 38% of the show was commercials. And when I talked to the television reporter of the Cleveland Plain Dealer and told them that, his response was, huh? I mean, here's a guy who's supposed to know, who follows the industry. And there's something about that linear flow of television that doesn't allow people to quantify what they've just seen, right? This story and that story and this story and that story, and now stay tuned, you know. Neil Postman, in one of his books, Amusing Ourselves to Death, says, there's no disaster so terrible, no crime so hideous, no victory of a sports team so wonderful, that an announcer can't break your mood by just saying, and now this, and they move on to the next story.
What do you think about this conference here with the people who are actively engaged in challenging and creating their own kind of media in the world of video and film?
It's always inspiring to see people who are trying to bring creativity to anything. You know, there's an art to everything, and there needs to be much more creativity. There's a certain kind of tyranny that takes place in media. You know, you have to produce your show every day or every week. You get caught up in the routine of that. The first thing that goes is creativity. And there's a tendency to just repeat yourself and do what's safe and lose track of how you can inspire and how you can communicate and how you can make an impression on people when you're forced to plug into the routines of media operations. Maybe 100 years from now, when we wise up, you know, a reporter will do one story a week, one story a month, and you'll have scores of reporters who are each doing that, right? So you can bring really quality information to people. Now, most of what we get is lazy and cheap and demeaning and dangerous.
So how dangerous is it? What's the greatest danger that we face? You've been talking about the dangers to democracy and...
Well, look at the violent culture we live in. Look how people don't vote. Look how people feel powerless. Look at the way Congress is letting these conglomerates take over and monopolize the media. Look how they've abandoned the idea of the public interest in the public airwaves. All those things are very dangerous. And look how the important problems of our society just fester, even amidst the cacophony of news that we get. The stations never explain violence. All they do is film it. It's very easy to point a camera at a fire, right? Any 10-year-old can do that. That doesn't take any skill. That doesn't take any insight. Problems of racism and poverty, the media doesn't seem to address them in a way that allow people to change. We measure one category in the newscast we call solution-oriented news. These are stories that give people depth and context and consequences and solutions and share successful models, right? Very rarely do we see stories like that in the news.
When you have the cities, there's 2 cities, right, that have actually gone through your whole program. You've crunched the numbers and given them back, the results. What are the
Well, we've been doing surveys all across the country, and now we're starting to export our methods to other cities. A study has just been completed here in San Francisco. It's the first one, where we gave people our software and our techniques, and they monitored all the stations in their area for a full week. And that report will be coming out in the San Francisco Bay Guardian Tuesday. There's a group in Boston at Emerson College who are doing the same thing with all the Boston stations. And we have people in Minneapolis and Detroit and Chicago and Seattle who are interested in doing the same thing, to shine a light back on the stations and try to challenge them to change their act. It's really quite scary that it's the same all over the country. When we do these snapshots of news on a single night all across the country, we find there are a lot of stories that are carried on all the stations. There's so little, you know, individual, creative reporting going on. On average, there are only 3 reported stories per newscast. Now compare that to a newspaper. They may have scores of reporters who develop skill in different topics, right? In education, in financial issues. The TV stations don't do that. They put their resources into fancy satellites and fancy anchor people, and they don't develop a cadre of skilled, knowledgeable journalists who can bring quality information to people. It's an outrage.
What do you think about the trend towards from national programming and local programming, and sort of the syndication of programs and losing local programming?
Well, economic forces are ruling the day. If you can put the same program out over 400 stations, right, you only have to pay for programming once. It's very different from having 400 departments, right, that generate their own information.
Anything else you want to add?
No.
Do you guys have any questions? Craig.
Have anything to say about...
You're not filming anymore?
No, because I'd rather someone else asked it. I'm still formulating as I go here. Do you have anything to share about how to become active in what one cares about? It's hard to do, Life is hard already. And to take on a big fight, like the fights that we take on, I think it's really hard work. Do you have any advice for...
Well, in a funny kind of way, everybody is a media critic, right? Media has become a dominant force in our life, and it's almost been turned into a weapon against us. We've got to break our own trance with media. We've got to say no, turn off the television, start getting our information from other sources, talk back to the stations, call them, write them, let them know when they do things you don't agree with, let them know when your issues are not in the news, let them know when they're overblowing and manipulating audiences. A lot of the content on television news is just geared to get an emotional response from people, whether it's a story to terrorize people or a story to titillate people, or a story about our great sports heroes. These are propaganda techniques that have been going on for centuries. The easiest way to get a suggestible and a susceptible audience is with violence. Goebbels proved that over and over. He sold Hitler to the whole German people that way. And in a curious kind of way, television content has now been perverted to be emotionally charged fluff, really, to deliver a susceptible audience to advertising propaganda. And more, advertising is the reason for television. In our last survey of 100 stations, 15 of them had more advertising than they had news. That's not what the people want. If the end product is bleep, the people don't want bleep.
Do you think that what would really benefit the country would be to have groups such as yours all over who are doing the kind of media watchdogging and media literacy work?
Well, we're trying to get people to say to the stations, look, we're watching you in more ways than one. We recognize the power you have. There's never been a medium as powerful as television, right? One of Jerry Mander's lines is that television is the most powerful advertising medium ever invented. It drives our consumer culture. All of the advertising is about buy, buy, buy. A lady from Minnesota on a call-in show a few weeks ago told me that when she turned off her TV a few months ago, she started saving $300 a month. And I said, oh yeah, how come is that? She said, well, I just don't see those close-ups of those juicy pizzas and all these other products continually telling me buy, buy, buy. TV drives the whole consumer culture, the whole culture of overconsumption, the whole culture of environmental degradation. It's really become an evil force.
If people are interested in your work, what's an easy way to get a hold of you?
Well, they can contact us, Rocky Mountain Media Watch in Denver, Colorado. Our phone is 303-832-7558. We're looking for additional volunteers for some of our other surveys. During 1996, we're going to track how local TV news all over the country covers the election issues. What I suspect we'll find is that there's very little substantive coverage of election issues, but plenty of advertising for candidates.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay.